LiSTNR production.
A murder on an island in the Pacific Ocean means everyone on the island at the time is a suspect. How did the police discover who did it? And what can we learn from people's behaviour in a bid to avoid being the target of violent crime? Kris Illingsworth is a former New South Wales detective who later trained with the FBI in behavioural threat assessment. In this episode of Crime Insider's Detectives, Kris takes us behind the scenes at one of Australia's most notorious murders. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives. 2002, you were called upon by the Australian Federal Police to assist in their investigation of the murder of a Norfolk Island local, Janelle Patton. Can you have a chat to us about that case?
Yeah, well, Janelle Patton, she wasn't exactly a local. She was there working on a 2-year temporary visa. So Norfolk Island, which is, I think it's around 1,800 k's off the coast of Australia to the east. New Zealand's actually closer to it, but it is an Australian territory. There's a couple of police officers on there. Beautiful island, very green and lush. Cows wander across the road. Oddly enough, I think the island's got 2,700 people, maybe 3,000 people on it. Oddly enough, there are 6,000 cars there at the time, many of which were these little kind of like Tonka toy trucks. It had the front that was very flat, kind of a small little mini tip truck and very flat. So there was a lot of them scooting around the island. So Janelle had been working there for nearly 2 years on this 2-year temporary visa. And the island had a 4-tier legal and social system. And at the very bottom rung was the tourists. They'd come in on a visa which was valid for only 30 days and then you have to leave. Then the next rung up was the temporary workforce, which ran for a 2-year visa. But if you fell out of work for more than 30 days, I think, you had to leave the island. So there's basically no unemployment there. And then the next group was a 5-year permanent resident, but 5 years. And these were considered locals. They'd moved there, wanted to change. I think Colleen McCulloch was one of those, the writer. And they were sort of just sitting underneath the top tier, which was the descendants of the
Bounty.
The Pitcairn Islanders, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and, as the story goes, the Bounty, the ship in 18-something, early 1800s.
Mutiny. Yeah.
Mutiny of the Bounty. Captain Bligh,
yes,
who later became Governor of New South Wales, and sailed off. They got stranded, shipwrecked on Pitcairn Island, which is way off to the east. And they lived there for a while, and then Bligh rowed away and incredible feat of navigation, managed to find his way back to England with a small crew, but others stayed on the island. And so, of course, they stayed and then populated the island, and eventually it was a case of overcrowding, so some had to leave, and the ones who had to leave found their way to Norfolk Island in around 1855, I think it was. Now, before that, the colony of New South Wales, which is basically Australia, 1788, food, water situation not great for the brand new colony. Let's find another source of food, send someone out to Norfolk Island and start agriculture there, and then import that food back to the old Sydney town as it was. So it's had 3 lives, and one was as agriculture support for the young colony. And then that wasn't needed anymore. The colony got going. And then I think it was around 1825, the worst of the worst convicts were sent to Norfolk Island, and it became known as like the Devil's Island of the Pacific. The French movie Papillon. Terrible, horrendous conditions, and this is the one place that the convicts feared, along with Van Diemen's Land. And so that was eventually stopped after about 30-odd years, just way too brutal. And then the Pitcairn Islanders arrived and then settled it as free settlers. And so that's how that all started. And so they kind of owned the island. I understand why they would think that and feel that. And then all these blow-ins start happening. And Janelle Patton was in the second tier from the bottom as a temporary resident. So she worked in the supermarket, hotel, bar jobs. I think she was 26 or thereabouts, 25. And so she was known. She'd been there for a while, and she did get a bit of a reputation for being a little bit obstinate or, set in her ways and a little bit hard to change her mind on things. So she put some people's noses out of joint, and she had a set routine of exercise and what she liked to do. And this was the Easter weekend when she was murdered, and her parents had arrived the day before to spend a week there with Janelle. And they were due to meet up for lunch at 12:30 this particular day on, I think it was Easter Sunday. And she'd been seen at the supermarket at, I think it was like 11:30 or 11:15. And then about 11:40 or 11:50, she's seen jogging, and she liked to jog. So she's getting a quick jog before lunch with the parents. And she's seen on a road which was on the eastern, sort of southeastern part of the island. And the island's only 7 or 8 k's wide by 5 kilometres long, so not very big. And she's seen jogging just by a passerby, and then she disappears. And then they search for her, and a pair of sunglasses are found by the side of the road. So she's missing and doesn't turn up to lunch. Parents are concerned. And then that afternoon around 3:30, something in a big piece of plastic, black sheet of plastic, is seen sort of off into the distance in a large green space area on the northern part of the island, so about 4.5 k's away to the north. And it started raining between 3:10 until 3:40 or 3:50 p.m. And the item is seen there then. Later on, when it's investigated better, around 6 p.m, found to be a body in this wrapped underneath and sort of wrapped in the plastic. It was dry underneath. So the body had been put there before the rain, which the rain started at 3:10. So it's about a 3-hour window when she's killed and disposed of. One of the interesting things when I went there was that, wow, there's such an open space that anyone could have come along. But perhaps the rain or the threat of rain kept some people out or indoors, but high risk for the offenders to deposit the body there. So she's discovered, identified. Parents have to do the identification, and she's been severely injured. I can't quite recall how many injuries, but something like 50-odd injuries, and some of them were evident of a motor vehicle collision, which would make sense. She was jogging on the road. She had a lot of broken bones on the left side of her body and a lot of road abrasions on the right-hand side of her body. So she's been thrown. But then instead of helping her or taking her to a hospital or even just leaving her there, the offender has put her into his vehicle and driven away with her, but not gone for help. So that's kind of odd. But there's another crime site that was never properly established where that was, and this was where she was taken to, and this black plastic that she was found with was later determined to have come from this offender's car. So there is another location, and at that location she was still alive. So the offender had a choice. Do I help her, in which case she can identify me because she's conscious, or do I kill her and that solves the problem of identification? So he chose the latter, and it's alleged that he killed her. There's a serious defence wound to one of her hands where the knife that was used to actually stab her once in the chest into the heart which was the cause of death. There was also a massive incision across the thumb area and forefinger, so she's had her hand up trying to defend herself. She had a couple of stab wounds around her face, but also some incision marks around her throat, half a dozen or so around her throat, which suggested that she was alive at that time, or at least may not have been conscious, but perhaps unconscious. But at some point it was decided that, okay, she has to be killed. And so a single stab wound, which was plunged into her heart and into her chest and was moved a few times in her chest. So then the body is taken from there and with this plastic taken to where she was found. Now she's found also with some paint flakes, green paint flakes, which had no primer on them. So she's in some vehicle, perhaps now this is a second vehicle, and conveyed to that site. So, I mean, there's a couple of things that don't add up. The offender who was charged was driving a car, not a little truck, as I was describing, with the flat front. And yet the pathologist, the forensic pathologist who did the autopsy, said the injuries are not entirely consistent with a collision. Some are, some aren't. But ones you'd expect to be there, like around the legs, the pelvis, face, weren't there. So there's this sort of odd mixture of car crash, something else is going on, knife attack, she's conscious, trying to defend herself. The pathologist thought with the heart injury and the other injuries that she may have undergone this attack for about maybe up to 15 minutes. And at some point she's also dragged along the concrete. What they said was concrete, given the sort of fine abrasion areas, whereas the roadway was a more rough surface. She also had a very badly broken, one of her ankles, badly twisted, broken ankle, which was not consistent with the car crash either. So it looks like there were two vehicles. Why would that be? Well, probably because I think there was probably someone else involved at this place where the driver took her for help, probably. What do I do? And, I dragged this case around the US when I was overseas for my FBI training, for my profiling training. And I went to the FBI and I showed it there, and I also with my training mentor in Miami. And it confounded pretty much everyone, some of this stuff. But one of the key things was, when does her victimology, victimology being the study of her background, who she is as a person, when does that kick in? When he sees her jogging along the road and goes, oh, there's Janelle Patton, I'm going to run her over? Or doesn't know who it is, runs her over. He says he bent down to pick something off the floor or change a cassette or get a cigarette or something and looked up and, boom, hits her. Which is probably right, actually, because the pathologist said the vehicle's doing only about 40 to 50 Ks. So it wasn't a high-speed attack.
Did he give, I might be jumping too far ahead, did he give any rationale as to why he took her to a second location?
He had to assess the situation. And I believe he said he'd been smoking cannabis, and that was his excuse. This was, mornings before lunch. No alcohol, apparently, but cannabis. So he's worried about that. And he too was a temporary 2-year visa holder.
So he'd lose his visa and be sent home and all the rest
Yeah.
of it. Now we're at that second scene. What's happened there?
Yeah, interesting. If we jump to the last scene, the disposal scene.
That's the third scene, the disposal scene.
Yeah. So the crime scene photos from my memory show, they pull back the plastic. She's lying face down in a very awkward position. It's clear she's just been pulled off a vehicle or out of a vehicle, given her position. Nothing ceremonious about it at all. And there was no sexual assault, no sexual interference. And yet, as she was lying face down, sort of her face to the right, both arms to the right, at the right-hand side, which was the exposed side, of her running shorts and her knickers were cut by scissors or a knife. And also her bra was cut. That's right. Her running top bra, which didn't make sense because there's no sexual interference. Why are you cutting clothing? And the skin wasn't cut, so it's a deliberate cut of the clothing in situ at that site because it was all still in place. It hadn't been, if you've been transported in a vehicle, you've just been dragged out of a vehicle, tossed, carried. Probably the broken ankle was probably during that process. So it's pretty rough transportation. If the cutting of the clothing had occurred, let's call it the major assault, the murder site,
the second scene,
then with all that movement of the body, those items should not have been in place.
Mm.
So that's been cut in situ at the third scene, at the deposition scene.
Second scene is where the knife wounds are inflicted and where you believe she was actually killed.
Yes.
And so she's taken at that point now deceased to the third scene to be disposed of.
Yeah.
And that cutting of the clothing, I'm getting a picture of like what would happen. Somebody raced into an accident emergency ward or something with injuries. They cut the clothing off so they can access.
Yeah.
Look at injuries and things such as that.
Which, given how violent this is, that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So, but if you didn't know anything different and you see cut clothing, bra, what would you think?
You think there's a sexual motivation?
Yeah. So if it's not a sexually motivated crime, and it's not,
what is it?
Why would they cut it? To make it look like a sex crime.
Do you know?
I believe it's to make it look like a sex crime.
To make it look like a male?
Yeah.
You think there's a female involved?
I always thought there was a female.
Because of that?
Mm.
Female have the capacity to move her body around and things? She's not a big woman?
It seems the driver, who was male, who was convicted, he was involved.
An accomplice.
But he's gone to somewhere. He changed his story a few times. Mm. But he later said that, he owed money to a couple, like male, female, on the island who are kind of bigwigs on the island and in the crime sense, and drug money. And, so he went to them and he later said, initially he just confessed to all of it because he was scared, he says, of them. And then later on he says, when he got convicted, he goes, well, actually it was them. I just took her there and they did it. So I'd already said this bit about the female thing, but he's definitely involved. But I would leave the door open to someone else being there too.
Did he cough to the homicide? Did he?
Yeah.
He did?
Initially.
I mean, it's a pretty violent way to get rid of somebody who you've accidentally hit in your car, isn't it? To stab them multiple times.
Yeah, he actually said that he drove to this location, opened up the boot of his car, saw she was alive, and went, oh, still alive, stabbed her while she was in the boot, he says, and then kept going to the deposition site, which is not how it happened because the way the knife was plunged into her chest and moved was not consistent with her being lying on her side in the boot. She had to have been on her back. Mm.
So he's obviously serving possibly still a custodial sentence for homicide, and since then, he's come out and with a plethora of additional stories.
Had a few versions, yeah.
Your gut feeling?
I do think someone else was involved. I think he went to another location out of panic, took her. I mean, it's possible that he left her there and just went there, and then they came back and got her, put her in a little truck then because of the paint flakes. There were no paint flakes in the boot of his car. So, yeah, there's some missing pieces in this, and the couple were of the criminal milieu. So killing her and disposing of the body is not out of the question. But, yeah, I think they were spoken to by the AFP, and I'm not privy to any of their interviews or anything. But I know the defence lawyer for the fellow who was charged kicked up a stink about it and said, he made the same point, actually. I don't know how he came to it, probably the same reasoning. But in court, it was alleged by the defence counsel that it was a female that was involved. The jury didn't buy it.
Interesting. So it's sort of it's a case that's been solved, but not really.
Yeah, I think there's just a couple more strands to it.
It's a niche that you still want to scratch a little from an investigative perspective.
Yeah. And for the family, they may have questions too about it, or maybe they're completely happy with how it is. I'm not sure.
Yeah. And when you shared it with colleagues overseas and FBI and what have you, Did anyone come at it from an angle that you hadn't? You went, oh, yeah, possibly. Or was it, did they all come up against the same brick wall?
Oh, there's a lot of conjecture about the type of vehicle. Was it an accident? Was it all stabbing and cutting? The pathologist actually thought more likely to be stabbing and cutting than accident, like motor vehicle collision. But in the end, it was kind of landed on, well, motor vehicle collision happened, and then it's becomes a panic. Like, what do I do? And then she's a witness. She's still conscious. She's still got her hands up trying to defend herself when the knife comes out. So she can identify them. So killed as a witness.
And you sort of get that. I mean, you don't justify it or condone it, but you sort of get that series of events, don't you? How
their rationale.
They're in a state of panic. He thinks he's going to be kicked off the island. He's panicking. What does he do? Does something without even thinking it through, and then all of a sudden, what was a 3 or a 4 out of 10 becomes a 10 out of 10.
Totally, yeah. It escalated to the max.
Did he have previous?
He did. I'm not sure what it was, but yeah, he was known to New Zealand police. He was a New Zealander.
Yeah.
Kiwi, and he did know her. They had worked in one of the bars or restaurants somewhere together, so there was a connection there.
I guess the thing that goes through my mind there, you've probably thought this 1,000 times, is did he hit her intentionally and then thought she was dead but she wasn't and then panicked, as opposed to the accidental drop something, it was an accident?
Yeah.
Maybe, is there a bit of that maybe, that he's done it?
There was conjecture for sure, but the pathologist thought, due to lack of some injuries, that it was probably only 40 to 50 Ks of impact, which I think if you're going to...
You put your foot down, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and that's around the speed you would do if you're just, tootling around the island normally. And the other thing was that, she's run over on the sort of the southeastern portion of the island, and the body's deposited on the northern side. So that would also say that the killer or killers are not from the northern side, that they're back probably around that eastern area, because you don't dump a body in your own backyard.
Get rid of it, like.
Yeah. So there's one other behavioural aspect to it. Interesting
case.
Yeah.
Interesting
They're
case.
all interesting.
They are. They really are. It's such a great insight, and it's such it's awful, it's terrible, someone's lost their life and a family have lost a daughter and bits and pieces, but it's such an interesting thing to work through, isn't it? Try to put those pieces of the puzzle, and frustrating, I'm sure, for those in your position where there's just one or two pieces still missing. Yeah,
as you know, like sometimes you just know who's done it, but you're just short with the evidence. So yeah, there are some that do get away with it. But I was always motivated by wanting to help the victim and to help the family and the friends of the victim. So I'm still motivated that way. So it's partly why I thought I'd talk on your podcast.
Kris, with this case with Norfolk Island, small island, small population, a lot of focus on this. When you were called in there by the Australian Federal Police, under what guise did you go in? Because as a profiler, that's going to create a lot of unwanted attention, I would think.
Yeah, the media was in a frenzy already about this murder on this island. First murder in 150 odd years since the convict days. And the law that they had, the Crimes Act, so in New South Wales we've got Crimes Act, it was the old New South Wales Crimes Act from 1800s, and back when it was the colony of New South Wales, the whole east coast of Australia was the colony of New South Wales. And so that was the old Crimes Act that they were operating under. And for murder, the penalty was death, not even, off to jail you go. It's death by hanging. So this is 2002. And punishment, alternatively, for other offences, like say perhaps a sex crime, would be leg irons and stocks. And that was still the law. And in 2002, thanks to Janelle's murder, one good thing that came out of it was that DNA legislation was introduced because of it. So they got dragged into 21st century.
Yes. Interesting. Interesting.
And the killer, because they had such a strict visa system, the killer's name was known. It was just a matter of finding who was the killer. There was some palm prints found on the black plastic that she was found with. That was basically the only forensic evidence they had. And so Detective Sergeant Bob Peters from the AFP from Canberra set up a fingerprint mass screening kind of like the DNA screening, but with fingerprints, palm prints actually. So they were after, I think they were aiming for around 1,600 people to come in, men and women, and to do palm prints. And that would be taken away and be compared to the sample from the plastic. So there was this operation going on, and that had a lot of media in and of itself. So this poor little island, all these locals are just totally bombarded and just getting smashed by these blowing tourists, and the media was just in a frenzy about it. It really put Norfolk Island on the map.
So they brought you in under the guise of being just another one of these fingerprint sort of specialists or technicians, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes, because they didn't want this whole volcano of stuff happening.
You weren't getting around in a jumpsuit with criminal profiler on the back of it, going to the local IGA.
No. No, they flew me in my own name, but I didn't have to go that far.
Yes.
And they didn't tell anyone who I was, other than we've got extra staff here for the fingerprint operation.
Well, there have been so many there.
There were a lot. It was set up kind of like, when you go to an election these days, you got your little booths, your fold-up booths, so they're using those booths to do the palm prints.
I guess you would have been not restricted so much, but you'd have to have been a little cautious with any sort of interactions you were having, because the chat would be going around like wildfire.
Yeah. So it was all, and the AFP guys knew, of course, and so it was all kept very quiet.
Yes, yeah.
Simply because they just didn't want to create this maelstrom of media frenzy. This case, as I said, was quite unique in that the name of the person was there. It was on a list. Definitely had the name. It wasn't until the palm prints from that operation were tested. Oh, I beg your pardon. The offender had actually skipped town. So flights came in and out of only twice a week. And I think, if my memory is correct, the offender skipped town fairly quickly, like within the first or second flight out, and went back to New Zealand. So his palm prints weren't taken. So it wasn't successful at first. And then eventually, somehow they got onto him, and then they palm tested him, and then it matched.
Kris, in the early hours of New Year's Day, 1999, there was a violent rape of a 91-year-old woman in Wee Waa. Now, Wee Waa is a small regional town, northwest New South Wales. In your role as the New South Wales Police criminal profiler, you worked alongside detectives on this case. I'm just really interested in your involvement in that.
Yeah, well, my involvement started off a while after the offence had occurred. So I think it was in August of 99, so 8 or so months later. And the detectives had pretty much come to a standstill. They couldn't progress their case any further. So they managed to find me in Sydney, and they sent me all the material. So I had a look at that, and I actually wanted to go up to the scene, because you always see the options that are available to the offender when you go to the scene and walk where they walked, and the choices that they made. But unfortunately, my boss at the time wanted my bum on a seat, so I didn't get to go. So I lost a little bit of valuable work there. But I worked on the case, I wrote a report, I sent it back to them, and then I didn't hear anything for a long time. In that report, amongst other things, I said I thought this offender would be known to the victim, to Rita Knight, because for a few reasons, but one of them was that he turned the power off before he broke into the premises. So it was already at night. It was after midnight, I think it was. And this says that the offender was very worried that if the light got turned on, he'd be seen and recognised. So Rita Knight must have known him somehow. Secondly, she was a very low-risk victim. She would not ordinarily attract a violent crime. She was inside her home. She was security conscious, so the doors and windows were locked. And she was a single woman, no kids, kind of kept to herself, known in the community, but she did nothing that was of a high-risk nature. Her only high-risk aspect was her vulnerability through her age and frailty. But indoors, minding her own business. So she should not have been selected. The fact that she was selected to be attacked says that the offender knew that she lived there, that she was in there, and that when he broke in, there was not, say, a family in there or a male who could confront him. He knew the victim was in there alone. And this, therefore, had to be someone who knew her, had been in the house before, knew where her bedroom was because broke in through the back window, broke the glass, hand in through the glass, opened up the door, found his way straight down to the front bedroom, which faced the street. And she was asleep. She'd gone to sleep as usual around 10. I think this was about 1 a.m. And she woke up to someone basically climbing on top of her. So this is what's known as a surprise approach for sex offenders. There's 3 different types of approach. The surprise approach, which as much as it sounds, the offender's trying to maximise all the circumstances in his favour. Or a blitz approach, which is the application of immediate and overwhelming force so the victim has no chance to respond. Or the third approach is a con approach, con and lure to another location. And that type of offender has social skills, verbal skills, and uses them. Whereas the surprise approach offender doesn't have that tool in his toolkit, so has to maximise the circumstances in his favour by surprising the victim. So he jumps on top of her, she wakes up, starts screaming. She's 91 and fights as best as she can against him. Now, the offender did not punch her, beat her, but he did get a pillow and pushed it down on her face, most likely as a functional, not a weapon, but a tool to stop her from screaming and raising the alarm. So he's trying to suppress the sound. And she was very deaf as well, and she wore a hearing aid, and she didn't have the hearing aids in. So she never reported any verbal, any words from him. Even if he was saying them, she just couldn't have heard them. So it's dark. She doesn't know anything that he might be saying, and he's now starting to remove her night clothes in the bed, pulls down her lower clothing, and does rape her, vaginally rapes her. And semen was found inside her. So this semen gave the DNA that was later used in the mass screening. The offender runs off. She staggers out of bed, very bruised, elderly person's skin, bruises so easily, lots of abrasions, scratches, and she scratched him as well. She was found on her front porch calling out faintly for help, and there were some revellers that walked by and some young people, and they went over and helped her, and that's how she was found, and ambulance, and went off to hospital, and from there went to a nursing home, and she never returned to her house ever, and she lived there all her life. Like her parents had died there, her sister had died there, and this happens, and she never got to go back to her house. She also smelt alcohol on him. So that speaks to disinhibition on his part. So the alcohol probably lowered his level, but he was there for sex. So the sex would have been unavailable to him where he might otherwise have got it. So it made me think that in a relationship, or perhaps a broken down relationship where he might ordinarily get sex, but on this particular night, something's gone wrong. There's been a triggering event, probably an argument, and he's gone in search of A, sex, B, with a bit of a skinful of alcohol on him, lowered inhibitions, and knew that Miss Knight lived here alone, so she suddenly became an opportunistic victim, even though she was low risk in her home. And it all spelled out that this person must have known her, must have known exactly who was living there, and took advantage of the circumstances. So the police carried out their investigations. I wrote the report. I said, obviously it's a male. It's going to be a male who comes to her premises. It's going to be someone she has an acquaintanceship with or a loose association with, but not someone who actually cares about her. And so we knew that there were 2 gardeners. So I said, well, it's most likely going to be one of those gardeners. That's who you should be focusing on. Meanwhile, we get a British police officer who became our Commissioner of Police in New South Wales. And he brought out 2 superintendents, British superintendents. One was Robert Napper. And Robin's job was to bring New South Wales Police Force into the next century with DNA. And Robin had his own battles there. But one day he came down and found me. I was working in the intelligence area. He said, "Oh, you worked on that case, that Wee Waa rapist case." Yeah. And I had been over to Bramshill, where these British guys came from, and I'd seen how their profiler worked. I was there for a month, and I had the privilege of working with him on a couple of jobs. And they had their serious crime analysis section and their injuries, medical injuries database, tools and weapons used, knives. They can match images to knives, and it helps the police identify what the weapon is. And they run very senior investigator courses on how to investigate crime, major crime. And I got to sit in on all of that. So I was really impressed with how the British were doing things, and I'd also been to the States, and I came to the conclusion that the Brits were doing it pretty well. So when Robin saw me, he said, "Oh, this Wee Waa case, it's perfect to use as an example to show the power of DNA through mass screening." And because Wee Waa is such an isolated little town and population of, I think it was 2,000, thereabouts, 1,800. So given its isolation, it pretty much meant that it was a contained group. So we knew, well, I believe the offender was from the town. The townspeople didn't. They thought it won't be one of ours. It'll be one of these blow-in cotton pickers, because there was an agricultural area of cotton growing. So they were pretty convinced it's not one of us. It's going to be one of these blow-ins. And they've gone. They've moved on. Whereas I was saying, no, it's someone from the town. And I remember sitting down with Robin. He had a big map showing New South Wales and Wee Waa and the isolated aspects of it. And he said, if we just go in there with a pretty focused purpose on who to select for the DNA based around your profile, we can probably scoop this person up through a DNA mass screen. So Robin kind of organised all of that, and it was the first time that barcoding had been used in New South Wales Police too. We barcode exhibit items for continuity. And so this is all fairly mind-bending for a lot of people. I thought it was terrific. Robin was convinced it would work. I thought it would work too. But some people weren't so sure. And at the time, and this speaks not only to New South Wales Police and misogyny that existed in the police at the time, but also to society more broadly, there's no adult sex crimes unit in the police. And so if an adult was raped or interfered with sexually, there was no dedicated unit for that. Local detectives would investigate, but there was no source of specialism to do with it. And it is as you know, it's a very specialist area. In the end, the homicide squad ran this DNA screen. Robin was senior to some of them, so he kind of guided, but it was under the instructions of the homicide unit. So I think they were a bit, we're homicide. And this is a sex crime. What are we doing? So, it was all a bit out of sorts. And then we get up there, the DNA circus rolls into town. There's police cars, there's media, there's police caravans, and, it's a whole big shebang, We get to the police station, and Wee Waa is just, it's the outback. It's just the Australian outback. So it's flat. And the police station there, which was fairly recently built, had this massive, it's like a 45-degree pitch to the roof. Like, what's that about? It doesn't fit. Turned out it was the Public Works. It was actually the Jindabyne police station, which is in the snow. So it had this big pitch roof for the snow, which got wrongly delivered to Wee Waa in the outback.
Not a lot of snow in Wee Waa.
None, zero. And so God knows where the Wee Waa police station went. So so we all sort of pitched tent in town, and everyone's wondering what the hell is this. There was media in advance, so that we thought there would be town support, and there was. We were aiming for about 500 males to come and assist by giving a sample and also filling out one of these mass screening forms, which was a behavioural questionnaire that I developed because at the time DNA, was fairly in its infancy. That's why Robin was there. And we knew that the labs at the laboratories at the time could not process 500 samples very quickly. It would literally take 6 months. And that was without doing any other case around New South Wales. So we needed a way to prioritise these samples. And how do you do that? So everyone voluntarily filled out these forms. It had 10 questions, but only a couple of them are really key. And you can't do it with every type of case, but I thought with this case it would work because he had showed he didn't go all out on her. He did hold back. And I felt that was probably part of because he knew her in terms of the physical violence. So I thought this could work. And so this was the prioritising tool. And I got a little snow boot room in the police station to sit in, a little pretty small space. And I sat in there and they would fill out the forms, do the DNA sample, all barcoded. The form had a barcode as well, all matching. And then they'd bring up these forms to me. And I had on the ground a piece of paper that said low, another one that said medium, another piece of paper that said high. And that was, what's the likelihood that this form is the offender's, so low, medium or high. Every one of them was going into low. And I think it was day 2 or 3, I got up to 330 forms, reading every single page, one question per page. So looking at every page on 330 forms. And the homicide guys are coming up, have you got him yet? I'm like, no, keep going, it's not here. Next day, have you got him yet? You could sort of see them going, come on. No, it's not here, keep going. Anyway, this was going on and Robin came up to me day 2 or 3 and said, hey, come downstairs. One of the local general duties guys has got something to tell us. So we go down there and a police officer by the name of Ken Anderson, local guy. And he said, look, there's a guy who skipped town shortly after the rape. And then when all the DNA circus came to town, he skipped town again. He went back to the same place, which was Warorina, which was another outback town further outback. I don't know, maybe 200 k's away. And so that's twice this guy's skipped town. He happened to have been the gardener. All right, what's his history? Oh, he's got a background of breaking into women's homes who he knew and lying in wait until they were either asleep and come out from under the bed, or if they were out, in one case he was in the bedroom cupboard and when the victim fell asleep he came out of the cupboard. Same thing, surprise approach each time. So like, well, we need this guy's DNA. The terms of reference for the whole mass screen operation were it had to be conducted in Wee Waa, nowhere else. And this guy's in Warorina. And so the homicide inspector went, no, can't do it. Doesn't meet the terms of reference. So we're like, come on, it has to be.
And just on that, for the benefit of those listening, we're going back to 99, 2000. Quite different rules, restrictions, processes around DNA, gathering of DNA evidence. Things have progressed a little bit since then where, am I right in saying, as a suspect for a crime of this serious nature, there would be enough to probably get a warrant to get DNA. But back then, it didn't come under the terms of reference for that mass DNA. He's outside of the area and you couldn't just go knock on his door and demand it.
No, well, there were no warrants even.
Yes.
Didn't even exist.
Yeah.
So because there's no legislation, that was Robin's job, make the legislation happen.
So probably inadmissible if a lawyer got hold of it. And yes, yeah.
But at the time, there's no legal requirement.
Yes.
So we go, well, Robin just said, because he was the superintendent, he said to Ken, the GD's guy, go get it. So Ken just went, yep. And off he went, disappeared for a few hours. Ken came back and said that, the guy was really nervous. Like he was shaking when he did the sample and filled out the form, and he filled it out. It was all voluntary. So I look at the form, still standing there next to the two guys, and I'm going quickly to the key questions. All right, this is him. This is completely different to the other 330. This is him.
So this was, and you don't have to go into detail here, but his answers to the couple of key questions are what jumped off the page to you from everyone else that had answered that questionnaire. Yeah,
and I don't mind saying what they were. I don't think it's going to be used again.
Sure. Okay, well, that's your call. What was it?
Well, there were a couple of questions that were key in this case, and that was, do you think the person who did this would be feeling sorry for what they've done? And the person wrote, yes, they will be feeling sorry. Like, oh, that's different to what some very interesting replies in many other a lot of, why you ask me that? Now, how would I know what they're feeling? This guy was pretty certain that, yes, he would be feeling sorry. And then another one was, do you think this person deserves a second chance given what he's done? And the person wrote, yes, he does deserve a second chance. So there were two people who wrote yes to that, and the other one was the local priest. And there was one other question that was of interest, and that was, what do you think should happen to the person who did this? There were answers like, there's a bit of, well, why are you asking me that? But also, tie him on the back of a ute with a bit of rope, drag him through town, tie him to the local cenotaph, let's stone him. Someone said, put him in stocks.
This is country town, New South Wales.
Yeah, but it's interesting because, you see, wow, we're really not that far from, if you take away all the fancy stuff, we're not that far away from the medieval stuff.
Fancy stuff like laws and things like that.
Podcast.
Yes. What did he say in his response?
Should be sent to jail. Yeah. Yeah, she wrote that.
Interesting.
He felt guilty.
Yeah.
And he wanted to do his penance.
Yeah. Can I ask, because it came into my mind when you gave such a wonderful insight into all the reasons that you were able to start to sort of filter down who this individual could possibly be, one of the gardeners, you were correct. The age of the victim, 91, that puts it in a unique category just there too, doesn't it? What was it about, anything about her age that led you to any other conclusions?
Well, she wasn't available because she was indoors in a secure premises, but she was vulnerable due to her age and her frailty. But it speaks to her vulnerability, which he knew. But it also speaks to how desirable she was at that point in time to him. To break into the premises, assault and attack the person in this way, such a vulnerable, frail person. So the desirability to do this was very high, and he overcame the accessibility by breaking in. So he's also had a bit of a break-in guy.
Not uncommon for serial sex offenders. Yeah. And also the motivation or the desire to do it is not purely based on a sexual gratification. It's a power thing and everything else, and she'd be ticking a lot of boxes in that regard too, I guess, for someone like him.
That's right. If you look at how... exactly what you say. It's a power and control dynamic. The offender who feels disempowered needs to feel empowered. And so he was socially inadequate, verbally inadequate, from the lower echelons of society, didn't have much money, much education. So, life was a bit of a struggle for him. And there was a triggering event that night. There was a domestic argument. And he was pretty angry about it. So it all kind of came together, plus with the alcohol, that he decided on her. So it was an act of targeted violence against this unsuspecting victim.
So I'm interested, there's a lot of senior police standing around you holding their breath, bated breath, as you're sort of reading through it, and you look up and say, I think this is our guy. What happens then? He's locked up?
Well, of course, we tell the homicide guys a little bit peeved, but anyway, good job. Good job done. So straight away...
That a woman profiler and an English bloke have sort of hijacked our case.
The sex crimes case. So Robert and I just went, right, well, let's take this DNA sample straight away to Sydney. And we had, an esky kit ready because you've got to keep it cool. I think it's like a 6-hour drive. Went straight to the labs at Lidcombe.
Is that the DSIRO that do that DNA stuff?
No,
or is it
Dale, Department of Analytical Laboratories, government.
Yeah.
Did all the paperwork, signed it off, and then it's in their hands then as to, how they treat the sample and what results they come up with. So they got the DNA from the kit and had a look at the sample from Rita Knight, the semen, and yes, it did match, and therefore it was him. And then he was arrested, and he did confess in interviews. So, that's when we found out, well, yes, he did have a domestic argument that night. And he said, I was angry, I was a bit pissed off. And I was walking home that way, and I knew she was in there. And I just, I'm going to do it. and turned off the power source at the meter box, because he knew that she knew him.
Would that be the first, New South Wales, would that be the first DNA link conviction?
I imagine it was.
Would have been up there, wouldn't it?
One of the early ones, at least.
Yeah. And look, I was mindful. I was aware of the whole DNA thing because it was a big thing at the time. It was the first time, any sort of mass type, and all the Bush lawyers and everything were sort of giving their opinions about whether it was right, whether it was wrong. So it was a big deal. I was totally unaware of the profiling that you were doing and behind that, and it's really interesting to see how the two came together. They were inextricably linked, to be honest. You wouldn't have perhaps got the DNA without the behavioural sort of questionnaire and all those things coming together. Yeah.
Yeah. So like an investigation will run, this spreading my hands apart, but have that much life to it. And with the profiling, you can come in at a certain point when investigators are stumped, or there's something particularly unusual, or something where they just feel like, oh, this is a bit odd, we need to get a little bit more assistance. So profiling is just another tool in the investigator's toolkit. And it's up to them whether they use it and how they use it. So then once I do my thing, I drop back out of the investigation and I go on to other cases. And then they might say, oh, Kris, look, we've got these persons of interest or these suspects, because it's a prioritising tool with the profile. And so what do you think about this? Or can you do something to help prioritise a bit more? And also media strategies, investigation strategies as well. So using certain keywords and phrases when you want to reach maybe not so much the offender, but the person around the offender, depending on the type of crime you've got.
Mm. So he ends up coughing to the offence. What did he get? What sort of a custodial sentence does he get for that?
Oh, look, I think he got, because he did have a history, I think he got 12 on the bottom, 18 on top, so 12 minimum.
Yeah, because it's aggravated. He broke in and violence and assault and what have you. So, and I mean, as awful as the whole case is, you look at, there's a part of you that would look at this from an analytical profiling perspective. You must have come away from that going, wow, yeah, okay, this stuff is good. It works. It made a difference. And you're up against a fair bit. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Robin in one of these interviews, the English superintendent that you mentioned, and he spoke very much about the pushback, from some of the old school homicide detectives. They just thought this was witchcraft, it was rubbish, it wasn't going to do anything. And here we are. It was a combination of the two that got the conviction. Yeah,
and I have to give kudos to Robin. Like, it was his vision, and it came from his experience in Britain, the policing experience there. It was definitely a team effort. All the parts came together.
And, the success in itself would have bred success. I mean, those that may have been on the fence a bit about it because it was all new, it was all different, walking away from it going, oh, well, the proof's in the pudding. That's how we got him. Yeah.
Yep.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original podcast. The production team for this episode was Holly Mitchell, Jade Murray and Link Kelly. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. That's all we have time for this week. As you can probably imagine, I'm a big fan of all things crime. I discovered a fantastic podcast on the other side of the world, and I'm totally hooked. It's called Red Rum True Crime. It's hosted by Grace Cordell. Each episode focuses on a new story, real life, real victims, real crime. A case I'd never heard of is that of the Candyman Dean Kroll. Imagine trusting the local candy store owner only to discover he's one of the most sadistic serial killers in history. Dean Kroll, who they've called the Candyman, lured innocent teens into a nightmare beyond belief. What drove him to commit some of the most chilling murders in Texas history is pretty unbelievable. You won't believe how deep this darkness goes. Check it out. Red Rum True Crime. You'll love it. The trailer is up next, and you can find links to Red Rum in our show notes.
Hi, I'm Grace, host of Red Rum True Crime podcast. These cases focus on the true victims of crime. Why not jump in at episode 114, the tragic murder of Jasmine and Aaliyah? The main suspect in this case gave an extremely bizarre interview to a number of press reporters whilst he was drunk, and reportedly high. He speaks about an awful lot on camera and has this completely inappropriate laughing and chuckling response when talking about the case. He may even have thought he was going to get away with the double murder he'd been accused of, but what he didn't know was that 2 undercover officers were on their way to catch him out, and he easily and willingly took the bait. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Red Rum True Crime. That's Red Rum, murder backwards, REDRUM True Crime.